Welcome back to another episode of Project PhD Cast. I'm your host and PhD student, Alison Innes. This podcast is a journey through my PhD research and experiences in real time. It's a little like a cross between a research journal and a diary. Today's episode is an extension of work I've been doing in my latest PhD course on theories and methods. This course, called Interdisciplinary Research and Writing in the Humanities, is a requirement for students in my program. The course explores ways of doing interdisciplinary research and the role of collaboration in academic research. In addition to readings and class discussions, we have also been developing a draft proposal for our PhD project that includes an annotated bibliography, our research questions and objectives, our methodological statement, and an annotated table of contents, i.e., what we're hoping we can accomplish. We also had the task of creating a research poster for a public poster session at Brock University on April 2nd, 2025. Now, if you're unfamiliar with poster sessions, it's a bit like a symposium or conference, but instead of people reading papers to a room of fellow academics, researchers stand beside easels, holding their posters, ready to chat with whoever wanders by. Posters are usually colorful and about 48 by 36 inches in size, so a decent size. Sometimes they feature a lot of written text, or diagrams, or photos. Like a written paper, there is a certain formula to them. An introduction, research questions, objectives. Sometimes they include a lit review or a bibliography. There may be results, if the research has already been done, and discussion of those results, and thoughts about next steps. I think this is the first time I've had to do a research poster in the humanities. I've seen them widely used in other disciplines, but back when I was doing my MA, they hadn't really caught on yet in humanities. They're a lot more common now. I find it useful to organize my thoughts with diagrams and visuals, so the poster has been a natural way to share some of my developing thoughts and evolving diagrams. You can check out a visual of it at the link in the show notes, of course. But as a digital humanities researcher, I wanted to push the boundaries of the printed poster. How could I expand it online? Inspired by a classmate, I added a QR code that links to a blog post with a text-only version. I thought that was a logical step. It would let somebody who uses a screen reader read my poster once they had the link. But then I'm talking about podcasts, so what about making my poster into a podcast? So my challenge today, in this episode, is to turn a very visual poster into an audio podcast. It shouldn't be too hard, right? Let's see how it goes. I'll start my discussion by giving you a sense of what my poster looks like. It's a typical 36-inch by 48-inch research poster in a horizontal landscape orientation. For the background, I've gone with a full-size image of a campfire on a beach at sunset, or maybe just after sunset. The campfire is bright orange and yellow. Landscape recedes into darker colors. In the upper left-hand corner, I have the Brock University logo. Usually something you need to put on your posters to represent the institution. And my title in the middle is Humanities, Podcasting, and Public Discourse, with my name and email address. Over top of the image, I have positioned a number of semi-translucent text boxes, each with a different heading. Introduction, research questions, podcast relationships, theory and methodology, outputs, and selected sources. So let's start with the introduction. Do you remember the last time you sat around a campfire, eating s'mores and sharing stories? We share campfire stories with an intimate group of trusted friends. But the growth of podcasting means our stories don't have to stay at the campfire. We can easily consume stories from anywhere in the world and anyone. Voices we think we know and trust can easily spread myths and disinformation in this unregulated space. My research looks at how podcaster, guest, and listener co-construct knowledge, intimacy, and authority to influence public conversations. Now, the campfire motif is one that I've been experimenting with in the past few months. I don't anticipate it being a long-term motif, but it's working really well right now. As you may have seen in one of my blog posts, it's something I came to through classics, thinking about how in the ancient Greek world, you'd share your stories about myth, in part sitting around a fire listening to a bard perform a song or poem for you. And I think there's an intimacy with a campfire, that you are sharing those things with friends and people that you know. But when we put our information out on the internet, when we share those stories more broadly, we can feel like we know the people who are telling us stories. So my next box on the left-hand side still is research questions. And I have formulated 3 research questions at the moment that are directing my research project. And again, as my research develops, these might be tweaked, adjusted, blended into one. But for now, these are my 3 research questions. Number 1, in an area of increasing myths and disinformation, how does the intimacy and trust generated through the medium of podcasts influence public discourse on critical issues? Research question 2, how do the host, guest, and listener co-construct a shared podcast narrative that may challenge or reinforce established ideas of authority and knowledge creation? And research question 3, how does the introduction of AI, artificial intelligence, disrupt the relationships between host, guest, and listener? And how does this disrupt the intimacy, trust, and authority found in the medium of podcasting? So I will get into my theory and methodology in a moment, but these questions have come out of the work that I have been doing for the past couple of years. So one of the things that I've been very interested in, as you will know if you follow the podcast, has been the police use of podcasts. A recent case, relatively recent, out of Toronto. It got me thinking about what happens when people in authority are using a podcast to present propaganda. We're living in a time of increasing mis and disinformation. So how are podcasts a part of this? And what role does the intimacy and trust that is inherent in a podcast? How does that play in our perception of the mis and disinformation? And how do we work together, you as the listener, me as the host, to kind of construct a shared narrative? You might feel like you know me. You might know me in real life. You might not. You might know parts of me. You might know work me or student me, but you don't know all of me. And I don't know you unless you decide to tell me who you are. And then this is all complicated with the introduction of AI. Even in the past year or two, we've seen this explosion of AI tools in the podcasting sphere. So what happens to a human relationship when we take the human out of it? What happens when we're telling human stories without a human? What happens when we're listening to voices that we think are human and we think we're forming an attachment to, but they're not human, they don't exist? A lot of really interesting questions there. And I haven't really gotten into thinking too much about those, but I've been keeping a close eye as new stories pop up on that. So my third section of my poster, my third little box, is called Podcast Relationships. And as I have been thinking about these questions already and about these ideas over the past couple of years, I've developed a working diagram or a working model of how I think podcasts, how relationships work in a podcast. So imagine 3 circles in the shape of a triangle, and one circle is the listener, and one is the podcaster, and one is the guest, the podcast guest. So you have relationships, and I will argue they're asymmetrical relationships between each of these people. But then this little triangle of circles is overlaid on a larger circle, which is the podcast narrative. So what is the larger story that podcast is telling, and how is it connecting with other stories? So in the case of the police podcasts that I have been working on, you have the podcaster / police, you have the guest and subject who also happen to be the police, and you have the listener. And then there's a larger societal conversation happening about policing in our society that this conversation in the podcast is intersecting with. So those are just kind of some of the ways that I am starting to think about these relationships and how they work, and how the intimacy and trust influences the story that is being created and influences our relationships with the other people in that triangle. So now on the right-hand side of my poster, column 2, the theory and methodology. Theory and methodology kind of bleed together a little bit, I think. So I've kind of lumped them together because they're connected. So theory-wise, I have grouped the kinds of theories, the theoretical approaches I'm using into three main groups. So one is the theory about relationships in public space. And here I'm drawing on Indigenous ideas of relationships and knowing. I'm thinking of Thomas King, the author, and what he has said about public stories. I'm thinking of kind of more traditional male academics like Habermas and his ideas of the public sphere. But then there's also Hannah Arendt, for example, who also talks about public sphere. So that as I develop that area, I may shift my focus between theorists I'm focusing on. There's also Joan Tronto and the ethics of care, and that's something I really want to pull out, is how can we use the ethics of care to think about our ethics of podcasting. There's Anderson's Imagined Communities, and there's Christian Fuchs, a great social media scholar out of Germany, who talks a lot about digital ethics. So those are some of the theories I'm using to think about. And then there's the media theories. So I'm thinking Harold Innis. He's a Canadian economist and media theorist. And he talks about the center and the periphery, as well as his ideas about the development of media and control over media. There's, of course, his contemporary Marshall McLuhan, also out of Toronto back in the day, who's talking about media ecology, among other things. And then there is Levinson, who carries on Marshall McLuhan's work into social media and applying McLuhan's ideas to our contemporary social media. And of course, Christian Fuchs again fits in here with his work on social media. And so thinking, is podcast a social media? Why and why not? I think there's arguments to be made both ways. And then kind of the third overlapping section, so these are like three intersecting circles, is communication. So thinking about Indigenous ways of knowing and sharing knowledge through story, thinking about myths and disinformation, thinking about journalism ethics, even thinking about Aristotle and rhetoric and how we convince people of things, thinking of Fisher and human communication, and Gannett and narratology and the factual narrative. So these three theory kind of sections overlap, and then my research questions kind of sit at the intersections of these theories. So then my methodology, and I think of my methodology as kind of a circle of arrows and a little bit like a washing machine. It's going to go around and it's going to keep feeding back into itself. It's an iterative process. So I have my podcasting practice, what I'm doing right now while I'm talking with you, writing a blog post and all of the work that goes into podcasting, but doing it in a way where I'm reflecting on the process and I'm making changes and I'm developing this, and you're watching it grow and change in real time compared to producing a finished product that then kind of comes out as is, right? You're seeing the evolution of it. I'm also thinking about how I'm applying things that I'm learning and thinking about. The second thing there is story work. So I'm, again, working on the definition of how I want to define story work, but thinking about conversation, thinking about reciprocity and relationship in that conversation rather than an extractive model of interviewing. Thinking about a critical analytic autoethnography, talking about myself and what I'm doing, and which is a little bit scary, to be perfectly honest, and reflection. Thinking about the social science language would be a semi-structured interview, but that conversation and exchange of ideas, the shaping of ideas together, and seeing people I'm talking with as collaborators, as a part of that research process, rather than as a source of information that I'm going to then take and do something with and not loop back to, not close that loop. So that's my methodology and my theory. So then what am I going to do with all of this? I have got these interesting questions, I've got a process, and this is my fifth little box on my poster, is my outputs, thinking about what's going to come out of this. So my goal is to create collaborative, open access, publicly facing and publicly engaged scholarship. And I want this scholarship to further podcast studies. It's a new field. It's a relatively new medium. There's a lot of exciting questions to be explored. And I want my research to help push those questions forward. But I want to engage as well, always engaging, always being collaborative in my approach. That's very important to me. So in terms of actual products, there is, of course, this podcast, Project PhD Cast. So I'll be developing the series of it in real time, the audio research journal aspect of it. But then I will also be producing some very specific episodes towards the end that tie in with my dissertation, with my actual written work as well. That will be bit more polished and fancy. I have a project website, my blog, again, links in the show notes, that works with the podcast and documents process. It'll host some of the output if I've got written results to share or diagrams, things like that need to website format. That's where that will go. And then I also want to produce some things that are really useful to other podcasters. That's really important to me, that I don't lose sight of the podcast community that I come from, the independent podcasters. So I want to develop a proposed syllabus for teaching ethical podcasting. What do we need to think about? How do we communicate this with students? And I am hoping at some point to actually do this, and so that then I can have a syllabus that I know can work. So for my actual dissertation, we're looking at one of the options in this program, which is a suite of 4 articles with an introduction. So I'll be writing an introduction and then kind of 4 journal type articles that go with that. And I'm really excited with that to think about how I can incorporate aspects of podcasting into the written form. How can I gesture to podcasting through my writing and through that form? And then I also want to produce proposed guidelines for ethical podcasting so that we can continue this conversation as podcasters and as podcast listeners, consumers. What makes for an ethical podcast? What are the practices that don't work and what are the practices that do work? And how can we think carefully? Because coming back to my introduction, we are in an age of overwhelming myths and disinformation. It is way too easy to perpetrate it intentionally or not, right? So how do we handle that as podcasters? How do we think about our care, what duties of care, of human relation we have to our listeners and each other as well? And then finally, the very smallest box on my poster is some of my selected sources. And you can see these on the website. I've got a lot of sources I'm working with, but just a few that I've listed. Of course, podcast scholars Laurie Beckstead, Ian Cook, and Hannah McGregor, they've all done amazing publications on podcast studies. Dylan Bird, a PhD graduate out of Australia, has done some really interesting stuff with journalism practice that I have found really inspirational around podcasting and democracy. Thomas King, I mentioned earlier, I'm thinking particularly his former Massey lecture from 2003, The Truth About Stories. Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel have a relatively recent book on the elements of journalism that really addresses some of the critical issues facing journalism today. This slide into both sidesism, what are journalistic ethics, what do journalists owe the public, what should the public be expecting from journalists. Really recommend it to anybody interested in current media issues or how issues are being portrayed in the media these days. Paul Levinson, who I mentioned before, bringing McLuhan into the digital age. He's got a couple of publications there. Dario Linares, Neil Fox, and Richard Berry, some more podcast scholars who have done edited volumes, but then also a lot of individual publications as well. Then Schultz and Heder on the oral parasocial relationship, and there's some other publications around that topic as well. So thinking about that relationship between the listener and the host. And Sean Wilson is just one of multiple Indigenous authors looking at Indigenous methodologies, thinking about relationships, and I'm finding that very inspirational at the moment, thinking about stories, relationships, and knowledge. So there you have it. I think I managed that. That's an audio version of my very visual research poster. And as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of links in the show notes. And obviously my blog has a lot more information about my research than I have included here. One of the really exciting aspects of research is that whatever you plan to start with, there will be interesting twists and turns along the way. And the final product rarely resembles the initial plan too closely. So this is a bit of a marker of where I am in this moment and how I'm thinking about my research in this moment. And those changes, the changes that are going to happen with my research and with my thinking, is a really good thing because it reflects my ability to identify and follow, which trails are going to be fruitful. Maybe even finding some that look promising but aren't, but to be able to incorporate and change that. Being able to incorporate the latest research emerging mid-project. Every week I'm getting new alerts for exciting new scholarly publications related to podcasts and communication, really rapidly changing. And it'll change through conversations and inspiration from colleagues and mentors and collaborators throughout. And I want my research to be shaped by those conversations. It feels like it would be really wrong to be talking about podcasting and thinking about stories here and not let people's stories influence my research. So it's going to be really interesting to listen back to this in a few years when I'm done this whole process and see what changes I've made from where I'm starting. So as a part of finding new pathways of exploration and perspectives on research comes through discussion with others. And I welcome your feedback and your perspectives on my work, whether you're a podcast listener or a podcast consumer or work in any of these many fields that kind of intersect with podcast studies. Either major theorists you think would be useful, or maybe not so major theorists. A new slant on an established methodology, an innovative way to share my research outputs. Feel free to get in touch. And of course, I always welcome the opportunity to chat with other podcasters, right? I want to hear about your podcasting experiences, whether as part of my research on the record or even just informally, knowing especially how independent podcasters in humanities fields are approaching some of these questions and issues, or if these questions and issues are flying completely underneath the radar and aren't really entering into conversations. That's valuable to know too. So do feel free to get in touch anytime through the website, link in the show notes, and we can chat further on or off the record. Thank you so much for listening to Project PhDcast, an audio research journal created, hosted, and produced by me, Alison Innes. You can, as always, find links and articles in the show notes. Please share your thoughts. Get in touch with me through my website. Learn more about this research project and how you can participate by following the link in the show notes. Music is Grand Dark Waltz by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com and is used under Creative Commons license. You can view this podcast with subtitles on YouTube. Transcripts are available for download by request. Project PhDcast is an ongoing project by Alison Innes, PhD student in interdisciplinary humanities at Brock University. This research project has been approved by the Research Ethics Board at Brock University, file number 23020MAURO.